The views expressed on this podcast are those of the participants, not of Reuters News.
Trump had said over the weekend he would impose a 25% tariff on goods from Mexico and Canada, but agreed to a 30-day pause on Monday in return for border and crime concessions from both countries.
Mexican soldiers were mobilized to the U.S. border on Tuesday to crack down on fentanyl trafficking. It's part of a deal between U.S. President Donald Trump and Mexico's leader Claudia Sheinbaum to pause his threat of tariffs for a month.
Will he? Won't he? Will he? Kind of? Just 2 weeks into his second term, US President Donald Trump has whipsawed markets repeatedly with hastily announced and then abandoned trade wars on neighbors in North and South America. First came a weekend spat with Colombia that threatened to spiral into immediate 25% tariffs, possibly escalating to 50%, over the treatment of deportees. Then, 2 days after issuing executive orders to place similar tariffs on Canada and Mexico, Trump paused new trade barriers for a month, following much fanfare over border commitments that seemed to retread past promises. At the same time, though, a new 10% tariff on China is going into effect. It's a chaotic flex of US leverage that reveals as much about how its trade partners would hit back as it does the potential damage that Trump threatens to inflict. What it means for exposed industries, how it might catalyze a coordinated global response, and what exactly the White House might be after are the focus of this week's Viewsroom. Welcome back to the Viewsroom, the weekly podcast that invites you, the listener, into a lively debate with our fellow columnists about the biggest stories of the week. I'm your host, Jonathan Guilford.
And I'm Amy Donlan. After the podium posturing, the executive memos, and the hurried last-minute negotiations comes the swift blow of tariffs, or not. Plenty of figures in the US administration, from Trump down to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, referred to the threat of import levies as a negotiating tool. What the White House could hope to win with them is far less clear. So, Jonathan, I think this might be the longest intro we've had. And I think it reflects how much has happened in the past week in terms of back and forth. And you mentioned all the numbers there. So it's a fascinating situation, the situation with the tariffs. I think I don't know what I expected necessarily from the start of Donald Trump's presidency, but yes, he's definitely started off with a bang. But luckily we are here with two people from the Breaking Views team that have been watching this situation very, very closely. So Peter Tarl Larson, editor-in-chief of Breaking Views, and Gabriel Rubin, who is our Washington, D.C. correspondent. So you're very welcome, Peter and Gabe.
Thank you. Hello.
Good to be here.
So Gabe, I think let's start with a relatively simple question here. What exactly happened between the inauguration on January 20th and now? And what do we know about Trump's trade strategy that we didn't know before?
Well, I think that's a deceptively simple question. That's sort of all in the eye of the beholder, right? So what happened essentially was that Trump came into office on January 20th. He spent that day talking to the richest people on earth at his various luncheons and other events of Inauguration Day. And then he had a session in the Oval Office where he signed a lot of executive orders, one of which was to review all of the U.S.'s trade relationships. It didn't immediately spark a trade war. He said that he would impose tariffs starting February 1st. So everything sort of was leading up to that day. Now, in the interim, as was mentioned in the introduction, there was this tiff with Colombia over the treatment of deportees on military deportation flights. The president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, was livid about the treatment of his countrymen on those flights. The Trump administration, of course, threatened huge, economy-crippling sanctions on Colombia. And then ultimately, over the course of a weekend, they were able to come to a deal. Essentially, that didn't really change the status quo very much. It seemed to improve the treatment of deportees on these flights a bit, which, of course, is an important humanitarian issue. but not typically the thing that ruins trade relationships between two major trade partners. So fast forward a bit to this past weekend, the fight between the US and its top three trading partners, Canada, Mexico, and China. And Trump, despite declaring victory, getting some commitments about troop deployments from Canada and Mexico related to border security and the stopping of drug and human trafficking and weapons trafficking. These are commitments that Mexico and Canada have made before. If anything, the troop numbers have been higher in previous agreements. Mexico agreed to 10,000 troops on the U.S.'s southern border. They've previously agreed to 15,000 troops. So these numbers are somewhat amorphous and all over the place. Canada agreed to create what they're calling a fentanyl czar. No one really knows what that's going to mean. So in terms of what Trump is trying to do with these tariffs as an overall negotiating strategy to solve every problem in the U.S. Landscape, the U.S. political landscape, when all you have is a hammer, every problem seems like a nail, no matter how small that nail may be.
Well, this is the issue, right? Was the nail actually drugs? The flow of fentanyl across borders? Was it this is the thing I'm still, and I think a lot of people are quite confused about. There's this bigger picture issue where, you have administration figures saying we are sending away so much wealth out of the US because of trade imbalances with neighbors and so on. And then you get this kind of climb down on the initial announcement where you had folks in the administration saying Canada has misunderstood this as the beginning of a trade war. This is something else. This is about fentanyl. I'm a little confused as to what this was actually about. Is that clear in a way? Because I know ostensibly there's...
It's not clear. We're just sort of watching this from the outside and trying to work out what's going on. But you're right, Jonathan. Obviously Trump has been very vocal for a long time that he basically sees countries that have trade surpluses with the US as somehow, taking advantage of the US, taking jobs, taking money, etc. And that he wants to address that. There was that famous quote from during the campaign where he said, "Tariff is the most beautiful word in the English language." And so there's definitely sort of, and it's been a consistent view going back way before he got into politics that he felt this way about trade surpluses and trade deficits. And that he would want to do something about it. So we have to sort of assume that ultimately there's sort of some objective there to say, actually, we want to do something about trade deficits. The other thing that's come up more recently and has been mentioned by Trump and others in the context of this whole battle is the idea that tariffs can generate revenue, right? And so there's been this suggestion, which the maths doesn't add up, by the way, but there's been the suggestion that if you impose tariffs, you can generate revenue, and that will then help you lower taxes because then you have other sources of revenue. The numbers don't add up because what you might raise from tariffs is nowhere near big enough to make up for what you might give away in terms of tax cuts. And also, obviously, the point of tariffs is that they tend to shift behavior, and so people who are subject to tariffs then manufacture elsewhere to avoid the tariffs, and the tariffs get reduced. So that doesn't really work either. But those have been sort of some of the objectives that have been talked about, and even at the end of last week, Trump was saying, this is not about a negotiation. This is an economic issue. Over the weekend, he was posting on Truth Social that there was going to be some pain for the Americans, but it was all going to be good in the long run. And then suddenly on Monday morning, you have people in the administration saying, no, everybody's misunderstood. This is about drugs, not about trade. And then obviously the calls with President Sheinbaum in Mexico and with Trudeau in Canada, which then lead to a postponement of these tariffs, which were due to come into effect within hours. So we don't yet know what happened. My hunch would be that, some of the more kind of grown-up people in the administration kind of got involved and sort of talked him off a ledge a bit. The other thing is, which is interesting about this, is that if you look at what happened in financial markets, so when Trump announced the tariffs over the weekend, the expectation was that there would be a very sharp sell-off in stock markets, that currencies would move. And there was quite a bit of movement, but there wasn't as much movement as you would expect if those tariffs were about to come into full force. And so even at the last minute, there was a bit of a kind of belief in the markets that he wasn't really serious and he wasn't really going to go through with it. And actually, that turned out to be correct. Now we have to see what happens in a month's time, but I think there's still I think that belief that a lot of people have, particularly a lot of CEOs that I talk to have, that Trump ultimately won't want to do anything that spooks the markets. That belief is still just about intact at the moment.
But Peter, I was kind of curious. I mean, I think when we talked late last year about what we could expect, I know it's difficult to use that word with Donald Trump, but how he could manage some of the things that he had promised to do and still grow the economy. And I think the word that we kind of were talking about was performative, that some of these things would be to make a gesture to show his voters that he was doing the things that he said that he would do, punish, these economic allies and, balance everything out. And I'm just sort of curious, though, there is an exception to this rule, right? Because China is going to be subject to 10% tariffs, which could really impact the economy. And that doesn't seem to be something that he's rowing back on. I was wondering if we were to look back maybe on Donald Trump's first term. Now, is there anything that could guide us as to what pain might be inflicted on China, given what we've seen before? What could happen to the economy?
Well, I mean, first of all, there are already tariffs on Chinese goods, right? So this is an incremental 10% that's coming in. It will have an effect, and China's already talked about retaliatory tariffs. It's one of the things we learned about this is you have to be very, very precise about the timing, because, for example, the U.S. tariffs I think came in, on believe on the evening of the 4th, something like that. The Chinese retaliatory tariffs are timed, I think, for a few days further out, which then leaves a window for some sort of accommodation to be reached. And even now in Washington, you have people who say, actually, we think there will be some sort of face-saving measure. So we have to see what happens. There are all kinds of theories that actually there's a grander deal in the offing with China, something to do with enforcing peace in Ukraine, and you can throw TikTok and you can throw all kinds of other things in there. So that might be why Trump may be prepared not to go through even with the 10% or to hold back from doing anything more dramatic. You remember on the campaign trail he talked about 60-100% tariffs on China. So we have to see how that plays out. I think there's still scope for some negotiation there. And the word performative, it does come to mind, right? I think there is a scenario here where he announces tariffs, then there's some hasty agreement with as you say, with a fentanyl czar, which I guess is that's like a drug baron is one level down, and then when you get promoted, you become a fentanyl czar or something. Nobody quite knows.
They're going to need an industry person.
Exactly. You get some sort of agreement gets reached. Trump turns around to his supporters and says, I promised you tariffs. I implemented tariffs. I've now reached the greatest deal ever with all these countries, and everything is much better. And his supporters believe him, and then everybody carries on as before. It's entirely possible. But obviously it doesn't address those questions that he's been unhappy about for a long time, about trade deficits and so forth.
Well, you talk about the performative nature of this, and what I keep wondering is how free Trump is to do this performance. Because look, we're sitting here on Wednesday right now. Like you say, we have a few days' time, maybe continuing leeway until we see whether the rubber meets the road with China. Will there be some bigger deal down the line? Gabe, what I do wonder is just brass tacks here, what is the fundamental legal basis on which this is all being waged? Is this just purely everything can be done through the executive? There are no checks on this. Is there a congressional element to this? Obviously, I think the nature of what requires congressional authorization seems to be changing by the day. But do we have a sense of whether there's any restraint on what Trump is doing, formal or informal?
Yeah, he is doing these through emergency authorities, which, give the president of the United States pretty broad leeway to change trade relations with another country if there is a stated national security rationale. Now, Trump, of course, has trouble sort of sticking to one rationale for a policy move. So he has, mentioned other reasons, whether that's a trade deficit is not a national security issue. drug trafficking or weapons trafficking, would conceivably be a national security issue. Certainly the courts in the US would be willing to give broad leeway on that. So whether there's a legal challenge here, remains to be seen. It seems that, of all of the things that Trump is doing within the executive branch right now, this is perhaps lower on the list of priorities for legal challenges, given what he is doing in terms of, impounding U.S. appropriations in other areas and not, using congressionally appropriated spending. So he seems, at least in practical terms, to be on fairly solid legal footing. But, if that starts to really affect, major companies' interests and they feel like they have no choice but to sue and feel like they have a legal case that he is not abiding by the rules of emergency authorities, then I think, that would be a last-ditch effort by these industries. Of course, American trade groups don't typically like to challenge the administration if they don't have to. They do, of course, regularly on regulations and things like that, but they only do it if it's going to ultimately serve their purposes. Do they really want to stick their neck up against, Trump's primary, economic policy in the form of trade policy? Probably not yet, at least.
Peter, I was kind of curious about just kind of thinking about, you mentioned obviously how sort of investors or how the market is sort of responding to these threats of tariffs. I was wondering, can you see any companies performing well out of this, or any companies doing particularly badly when it comes to this, or is there much of a reaction? Because one thing that I am starting to notice from certainly the companies that I cover, so consumer goods groups, is that there's a big effort to talk about opening factories in Arkansas. Basically showing that their supply chain is based in the US. And I, again, use that word performative, whether that is actually them really making big moves, or is that to make it look like this is sort of working and that there will be jobs created, whether that actually changes the total makeup of these companies or not.
I mean, there are different levels of this, right? I mean, obviously, on one extreme, you have Masayoshi Son of SoftBank, who kind of went to the Oval Office and said, "Oh, we're going to put," I can't remember if it was the Oval Office or Mar-a-Lago. I lose track, but and said, we're going to invest $100 billion and create tens of thousands of jobs, which was a repeat of what he did at the beginning of the previous Trump administration, where he promised $50 billion. So, and do those numbers actually get invested? Are some of those numbers, investments that have already been committed or already been made? Will those jobs ever actually be created? Who knows? Is anybody really keeping track? Probably not, right? But then on a more fundamental level, I think what you have seen is for some companies, and this already started, with the first Trump administration, and then also with COVID, of companies just being much more thoughtful about their supply chains and thinking much more about trying to sort of source locally, and so you definitely find, I mean, it depends a little bit what industry companies are in. Obviously, if you're Apple and you're assembling iPhones in China or India, then, you can't start, you wouldn't, it's hard for you to start doing that in the US. But, you talk to companies that are in the building materials business, and they will make a great virtue of the fact that all of their supply chain is local, and therefore they're not subject to tariffs and so forth. So I think there is performative stuff, and then there is sort of more fundamental stuff that people are thinking about. And also bear in mind that, the Biden administration gave great big incentives for, semiconductor manufacturers to start building plants in the US. Again, in the grand scheme of things, it would take a very long time for the US to manufacture a meaningful number of chips compared to what Taiwan does. But you've got to start somewhere. And so I do think that process is beginning, and I think it probably continues. On the flip side, the companies that are exposed, we saw this on Monday morning in terms of the stock market reaction, particularly in the auto industry, right? The car companies that have got quite complex supply chains where things get manufactured and then assembled in one place and then moved across the border to Mexico, Canada, and another bit gets added and then back across the border again. I mean, tariffs would really, really mess with that. And so we saw definitely the car companies getting hit on Monday morning and then recovering a bit when people realized there was a reprieve.
Yeah, we also saw that with agricultural suppliers, especially Canadian companies. Right. For instance, was a big maker of fertilizer, and Canada is the number one supplier in the world of potash, which is a very commonly used fertilizer in agriculture. So a company that supplies that was hit badly on Monday morning before the deal with Trudeau was struck.
Right. And the talk of automakers, I can't help but think of one specific automaker and the threats of retaliation that were coming from Canada. Obviously, you saw Chrystia Freeland talking about, we will target Tesla specifically. CEO Elon Musk, member of the Trump administration, effectively now at this point, close ally. It feels like this administration could be uniquely vulnerable to targeted pushback like that, right? Not only with Musk, who with Starlink is obviously premised on being an international service that reaps revenue from everywhere. Tesla depends on a globalized supply chain. Half of its revenue comes from outside the US. I mean, there's probably other bits and pieces here, right, Gabe, where there are specific individuals that other countries could really try to push back against.
Yeah, so it's individuals and then it's broader constituencies, right? So you have, let's take the Musk actions first, because I think they're really the most important here, given his extremely outsized role in American politics and policy right now. The Canadians, have been very open about wanting to target Tesla. Doug Ford, who is the premier of Ontario, the most powerful Canadian province, excuse me. Sorry, my American bias.
Yeah, you've got to be careful not to refer to Justin Trudeau as governor next. But
yes, exactly. But he said, that he wants to cut Starlink contracts. So Musk's business is certainly very exposed to that sort of retaliation. But then in a broader sense, Trump, or at least Republicans in Congress feel vulnerable to trade retaliation that targets their particular states and their particular industries in their districts. So whether that is bourbon from Kentucky or American oil or natural gas or whatever it happens to be, very specific products. I saw, specifically they're going to go after like peanut butter from a specific place that was in the Canadian list of items that they planned to sanction as part of a round of tariffs. So they know how to play these games, they meaning U.S. trade partners. They know where to sort of hit the U.S. constitutional system, the U.S. federal system. And it's a way to sort of not wreck your own economy by sort of continuing to have access to U.S. consumers who make up, 2/3 of U.S. GDP, but, making that impact really felt by the people who actually have Donald Trump's ear, which would be, the industrialists who have his ear and the people who represent red states and red districts.
Yeah, I mean, I would also, the other constituency over here obviously is the tech companies, and you're seeing some saber rattling, sort of coming out of the European Commission, sort of saying, well, they have these powers which would allow them to do fairly drastic things like suspend intellectual property and stuff, and they could sort of target, they could point that at the tech companies in retaliation for some tariffs that they thought were unfair. I mean, again, seems unlikely that will actually happen, but it's sort of everybody's sort of kind of showing off their armory and kind of saying kind of we have the ability to retaliate. And the Europeans did this. I mean, they did this incredibly. What the stuff Gabe is talking about, the Europeans did this to an incredible extent in the first Trump administration. I think certain stage they came up with a specific tariff which basically affected imports of Harley Davidsons, right? Because they wanted to, and they kind of had like a sort of, it was particular motorbikes with particular kind of size of engines and so forth.
And just to sort of illustrate why that's important in the U.S. context, Harley Davidson is based in the extremely important swing state of Wisconsin.
Right.
So that is a very well targeted. Also, they're typically ridden by people who stereotypically might vote for Donald Trump. Very well targeted tariff by the Europeans on that one.
But I think the other thing you've got to remember here is that all of these countries that are trade partners to the US, it's generally the case that they are more dependent on trade with the US than the US is on trade with them. I mean, obviously, these are very large numbers. I mean, I think China, Mexico, Canada is 43% of US imports. But it is also true that the US economy is less trade dependent than Canada or Mexico or China or large parts of the EU for that matter. So there is an aspect to this, which is that if we get into tit for tat measures and retaliations, everybody will be worse off, but actually the US trade partners will probably relatively worse off. So there is also a really good reason for everybody to want to try and avoid this as much as possible.
It's hard to know, as we said, just to what extent he's actually going to follow through with these things. But I think from what we're all saying here is that it's very clear that a lot of tension is now being created between countries that were once getting on quite well, trying to revive their own economies, and are now essentially trying to think about how they can punish, target. Like, that's what the effort seems to be now on, and that communication. So, time will tell. Well, Peter, Gabe, thank you so much for your time. I feel like this is not the end, or even close to the end. So I'm sure we'll talk again.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. This podcast was produced by Oliver Taslich in London. You can listen to a new episode of The Viewsroom every Thursday on the Reuters app or your favorite platform. And don't forget to tune in to our sister podcast, The Big View, every Tuesday, as well as other great podcasts from the Reuters team. If you like what you heard, please follow The Viewsroom and let us know what you thought. And check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day at breakingviews.com and reuters.com.